Hello, welcome to International Business Conversations. My name is Irina Koch, and today my guest is Arvind Lall. Arvind is attending this series second time. I'm very delighted. How are you?
Very well. It's a great pleasure to be with you again, Irina. Great pleasure indeed.
Today we are starting a new conversation series on
Yes.
ethics. Can you please tell me, how did you develop the interest in studying ethics, but also how did you develop the interest in teaching ethics?
Right. All right. It's a very good question. Now, just as a general point to say that I'll be touching, skimming the surface for your colleagues. Other colleagues will look at things in depth later on. So what I can do today is just skim the surface of a course which eventually I set up for postgraduates at university. So what is the history of it? Well, the history of it is very simple, a bit unusual in a way. I suppose it comes back to me in the end, is that I've always had an interest in theology, in ethics, and my degrees are in that area, and I looked at ethics not just simply as an academic subject, but something which I looked at, in real life. I looked at it when I was younger. I used to talk to my parents about a lot of it. My father was involved in the ethical side of education. And then when I went into practice, I practiced as a chartered accountant, and I had clients, including international cross-border business, that it all came to the fore. And an opportunity arose for me to bring together theory and practice and ideas from real life. So whilst I was aware what the textbook said, when I joined university to teach, I felt that there was nothing going on at university, certainly in the social sciences. We're looking at ethics more from an academic perspective, plus from a practical perspective. And so I created a postgraduate course on the ethics of international business. Now, ethics, you can't put everything into boxes. Ethics is ethics. There's no special ethics for business. There's about people, business is about people, and therefore you have to see it from a perspective of people. Corporations are just exist in the imagination of the law, so you can't force them to do anything. It's the people that run them. It's the people that can be influenced. It's the people who do the wrong things, and it's the people who do the right things. And of course, it gets more and more complicated as we look across borders into different cultures. People have different assumptions. People have different backgrounds into their way of thinking. Sometimes it's religious. What we call religious, you might think, for example, in Confucianism, that is religious. Well, they don't have the same concept of God, for example. So in Christianity, you have a basis of, that our ethics comes out from certain beliefs. Okay, so we're looking at some very complex areas. And one thing I found with my students when I set up my postgrad course, which is unique at the university, and I found that students were there from all parts of the world. And I had to be very careful that I wasn't using just a Western language to describe ethics, because there becomes a kind of imperialism, if you forgive the term, that we only assume that everyone just thinks in our way, but of course they don't. And businesses are beginning to find that as a problem as well, just to get the message across to each other. How do we behave, with each other when we do business? And of course, the large corporations are now trading internationally, have been for a long time, and they do have a problem. How do you behave in another country? You're using the benefits of trade in the sense that maybe it's very cheap labor, so you set up, So all of these things begin to throw a lot of questions of, are we doing the right thing or are we doing the wrong thing? And how do we decipher something is right or is wrong? And from our perception, can we get an idea that we actually are looking at the right or looking at the wrong? And how do we correct it? Or how do we negotiate a way of working with people? They're all human beings at the end of the day. So businesses in the past in the West in general have been very focused on shareholder value. It's all about, the profits that go in. It's a very much of an American model, really, stroke UK, stroke European model of developing as many profits as you can at any cost. And this is any cost that becomes a bit of a problem, that someone suffers because of just promoting shareholder value. So when I was teaching the course, I was aware that I had to be very careful that I wasn't just promoting a view of things. So I then also related that to my practice when I was practicing, because I ran my practice the same sort of time as I was teaching for a number of years, although my practice got smaller, but I worked with European countries and it was cross-border. And there was the constant problem of clients saying to me, well, how do we save a huge amount of tax? And I said, well, if you begin to save it in the wrong way, then actually you are doing the wrong thing. So you could be doing something which is illegal. You could be doing something which is unethical. So there have been problems about, even in a small area like Europe. So you can imagine that if you went into other cultures, how do you translate the word virtue, for example, from a European perspective into virtue, from a Chinese perspective or from a Japanese perspective? So there were all these things, and all I found at the end of the day was to be very open with the students and say, well, how do you feel about it? Okay. You can't really teach ethics as such or make changes. What you have to do is you have to give them sort of background for them to think about what is going on and for them to decide to take a position. And I think businesses are going through the same thing. You can't just give them a magical formula and say, well, that's the way to solve this problem. Well, you need to have a conversation with people across borders to see, so you learn from each other. The one thing which I found in common was that they recognize that there is a kind of humanity that we all agree with, but there's also the other side to it, which is greed. Greed is a major problem in business, whichever country you come from. There's a human failing in us. And this is where education begins to give us that refinement to be able to do the right thing. And ethics comes into play. I may want to make one further point on this one, and we can discuss a little bit more. And that is that, where do we stand with the law? The law is an important point that we need to bear in mind. A lot of people believe that ethics comes into play where the law cannot do any more. So effectively, the law has gone as far as it can, and then ethics comes in and then begins to question everything that is going on around it. So ethics has a very, very important role to play. And I think we're looking at international trading. And international trading, I think, can be successful, but it has to overcome, and it's not going to be easy. It has to overcome this problem of being able to trade in a fair way, that there is some sort of justice in the way that we trade with each other, that it becomes a fair exchange of goods and services. So from my perspective, it became not just a case of theoretical abstract principles. Moral principles. What are moral principles? They are the principles about, they're like abstract principles, if you like, from a Western perspective of what is right and wrong. What are ethics? Well, ethics is the application of those principles. Okay, so in simple terms like that, you had to explain to the students before we could actually go to the next step. So they began to understand. But language is so difficult to translate between cultures. So I did come across that problem. And I'm hoping that as this conversation goes along, that we'll be able to pick out one or two other bits, and we'll be talking in general terms. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a feel of the excitement of ethics, but also the problems that we meet in ethics every day.
Certainly, and I do have more questions coming in your way.
Sure.
I'm covering the aspects of ethics. One of the questions is, what is the essence of ethics?
Well, the essence of ethics is to really question what we are doing. Is it right or is it wrong? And it's not easy to find. Okay, you may have an intuition, perhaps I'm being a bit greedy. Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? Am I treating people in the right way? The essence of ethics is to try and get to a position where you're doing something which is fair and just and is acceptable to yourself as a human being. Because in ethics, one of the essence of ethics also is that it's not you that's affected, it's the other person. What you do, how does that affect the other person? It's not just about me, it's about them, really. What am I doing that is right or wrong? And I need to question myself. And that brings in the dialogue sometimes that we're looking at. So ethics is about trying to get to a position where if there are problems, to try and make the wrongs into a right if possible. And that's not going to be easy, but that's what ethics is about. It questions you, it forces you to question yourself, whether it's through an intellectual aspect of looking at, 18th century European thinking on liberal thinking about people's freedoms and rights. Or it may be an intuition that you have as a human being that moves away from the textbook. You say to yourself, well, I just feel whatever the book says, I just feel this is right or this is wrong. So there are different ways of getting to the answer, if you ever do get to the answer. And all you can do at the end of the day is to come to a position which seems reasonably okay to proceed with in the future, something sustainable, as it were. That's another word that we use in business quite a bit.
You mentioned previously companies that operate across borders. So we talk about multinational enterprises, and multinational enterprise is a firm that operates across the borders, and they operate in different environments, and every single country would have their own different cultures. Do you have any thoughts on how to ease the challenge of those companies and make it a bit easier for them to operate in sometimes conflicting environments?
I think it goes back in a way, any kind of answer that is found for companies has got to come to the people who run the companies. And I think it starts by, in my opinion, it's education all the way down the line, where you begin to question, you have a discourse. And people who run businesses, to me, at the end of the day, are the ones who resolve the problem. People at the top or the management will resolve it. But the management has to start by recognizing what the problem is. We do not, because we are busy people in business, give a slightest importance to things because we are too busy doing things. We're trading, we'll just go and trade here, we'll go and trade in that country. This is the way we set up a corporation. All we want is shareholder value, and we'll get some managers in this other country. The company which is set up is not necessarily a UK or a US company. It could be a company in another country, but it's controlled. The shareholders are from overseas. So the structures also do matter a lot. In other words, what you've got people at the top from two different nations and two different cultures. And I think what we need to look at is we have to have a conversation before we even start trading to say, what are going to be the problems, which means we need to talk to people in the other country and say, look, you're going to be part of the management team. What problems do you see? So let's take one, which is a classic example of gifts. You can either call it a gift or you can call it a bribe. Okay. Gifts are okay. Bribes are not so okay. Okay. Now, there are lots of countries, in the oil business, etc., where it's just taken for granted that that's the right thing to do for government officials to take bribes. Okay? It's just the way it is. It's not something that people don't know about. In other countries, to give a bribe is a wrong thing. They used to be acceptable in the West, but now it's questioned. But it is still part and parcel of their day-to-day business. To what we call bribes, for them, there's just gifts to smooth the path to get business. Okay, So for one person, it might look unethical. For the other person, it's perfectly normal, to do that. So no one is accusing anyone. But what we're saying is now we have a conflict here. We don't feel comfortable doing that. So how do we resolve this problem? And so once you recognize that there is going to be a huge problem, because if you don't resolve the problem, you cannot do business. If you're looking from an ethical perspective, if you're looking at purely from a commercial perspective, then that may be slightly different. And I know that this is just one example. One of the resolutions that certainly UK corporations and US corporations began to do was to be very open in their financial statements at the end of each year and say, look, we've had to pay these amounts, to get business. And there was a requirement to do that. So in a way, they were not hiding it. They were actually saying that that's what we had to do to get business. So from their perspective, from a UK or a European perspective or US perspective, they went part way to trying to resolve the problem because they knew that there would be a problem from an ethical perspective. How that has affected the people in these other countries who've actually received these facilitation payments, if you like, I don't know, normally call them bribes, but facilitation payments, how they deal with it is something that maybe they begin to learn and say to themselves, well, hang on a second, if we take this money, we are not contributing to society. This money is coming to us. Society has been deprived. And the other thing that's important to remember is most of these countries that the Europeans or Americans deal with are very poor countries. The society is very poor. And so if money is only going to the hands of a few, that becomes a bit of a problem from an ethical perspective. So it seems to me that once the problem is arisen and brought to the fore, the people on both sides begin to think, now, where are we acting in an ethical perspective, in an ethical way or not? And I think this is the start of the conversation. So it goes back to education, because no one has actually been even confronted with the problem in the first place. So in a way, there's this combination of a dialogue, I think is really the starting point. And how they deal with it depends on their own type of business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
In your own practice, you had to deal with some of the ethical challenges. So can you please share some of the challenges with me?
The biggest challenges that we had was through regulation and through tax avoidance, which is not illegal. People wanted to be able to trade in such a way to have things set up, which would give them the advantage of tax avoidance. So being a professional, I have a double problem. Not only am I looking at the ethics of the client, by the way, which I never took, never complied with, but I'm also looking at my professional ethics. I mean, I have the power or the knowledge or the power knowledge or the technical knowledge to be able to do something which is not illegal. The question is it ethical? So from my perspective, there were problems. And also the other thing which I came across was that in certain countries, even in Europe, in some Mediterranean countries, it's just quite common to have to negotiate your tax position. You don't have to pay the whole amount of tax. You can negotiate your position. And there are people who do that. And they don't see it, anything is wrong. So you don't pay the whole amount of tax, you negotiate it. Now, from our perspective, that's not the way we do things. If certain X amount is due, then you pay X amounts. But there are problems in some countries where there are agents who will negotiate in this country not to pay the whole amount, and their internal revenue services appear to accept that way of doing things. So there's a cultural gap in the way things are done. So it becomes very uneasy, for someone like myself who looking at cross-border, but then it wasn't my position from the other country's perspective to negotiate the thing that was done by someone else, although I was aware, but our position was aware. And I said to the client, you must do the right thing. We will declare everything completely what is due. and then they will have to deal with it. But in their country, in this other country, perhaps the government are aware of the situation, but the culture was so different to ours. So, there are great disparities in things happening in these countries. And sometimes I think to myself, well, are they doing anything unethical? Maybe from their perspective, they're not, but from our perspective, they are. So as a practitioner, to advise people, you can be put in a very, very difficult position sometimes, because what happens at the end of the day is there may be other people who will comply with the client, which means you lose the client. From a commercial perspective, it can be damaging, but then from an ethical perspective, it's probably the right thing to do is say to the client, no, I'm sorry, but I can't do that for you. We will do the right thing together. And that's the way I used to work with them.
The final question that I now ask all my guests, but because I have already asked you a similar question before, I now will rephrase it. A word of advice for students regarding ethics.
Well, I think the best people to give advice to themselves is themselves. Because I learned from students that as human beings, we are already aware that certain things that we do are right, certain things that we do are wrong. And all I would really say to students is that this is a really fascinating area. I know it's an area that I love teaching. I'm involved in real life and practice, or was. Now I don't do it anymore. But it's a fascinating area. And it was for me, I was very lucky when I was teaching. It was a fairly prominent module. And I used to get students from all disciplines coming to my courses. It was packed. And it was wonderful. I didn't even have to give them any advice. They would just pick up themselves, and they would research it themselves, they would discuss, and they would bring in their cultural aspect, the human perspective on situations that companies face around the world. And just to say that there's a lot of stuff that you can look at in publications, in papers, in even on TV and like there are lots of things you can look at, and there's some very interesting areas that are published in the media which you can have a look at. There are huge amounts. This is one of the big things. So what do I say to my student? I say to my student, be open, okay? And the only way, as in real life and business, that something will work from an ethical perspective is when you can convince yourself and you buy into it. And that applies also to companies. When individuals and leaders of companies, like students, like you, like me, think about it, which we've not had a chance to really think. This is half the problem. We don't have the time because we are learning, technical stuff, formulae, etc. Ethics is a very different approach to life because you have a language in your head that you can relate to. Students can relate to that. I mean, they used to come up with wonderful ideas for me. It was very stimulating. And I hadn't even taught them that, So it's a question in real life. Companies need to open up a dialogue and then buy into what they want to achieve. Don't just do it as a mechanical exercise. At the end of the day, you have to be convinced. If you're convinced as the CEO of a company, if you're convinced as the board of a company, that that's the way things have to go, it's the same as students. You have to buy into it. And if you buy into it, you will make a difference. Okay. And it is very difficult to just give them an answer just like that, a mechanical answer, because that won't happen. Companies are going to take years to get to a position where they can work across borders. There has to be an understanding. There's also going to have to be changes in the law. Other countries may have to legislate against certain things going wrong. So, for example, giving of gifts. Some countries which never would have legislated now have to legislate. The best advice that they can give is give advice to themselves, but it has to be advice that they can buy into. It's something that has to resonate and sit with them, and that's going to be the same in real life. If you can buy into it and you believe in it, then you will make something happen. Rather than be pushed by the law, you got to change. The individual has to change at the top, and that includes boards of directors, CEOs, whichever country that you live in. But there's going to have to be a give and take. It's never going to be, we have the right answer. It's a question of give and take. And then you set up an agreement between the subsidiary and the holding company, wherever that is, that's the way we're going to operate. Because if they do that, it will save some huge problems that we are facing today. Problems of labor, of slave labor, with problems of the environment. And these are huge, huge problems. This is survival that we're talking about. Ethics is not just about making money or not making money. It's a much, much bigger question that we're asking. And I think there is an intuition in ourselves, sometimes tutored by the intellect through abstract principles, that we can get the balance in getting something right. And I think justice and fairness is probably the essence, I think, of any ethical action.
Thank you very much, Arvind, for this amazing conversation. And thank you very much for being my guest for the second time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.